Hello, spicy people of the internet. Spice8Rack here, aka Consecutive Watermelon Injuries, and today's video is going to be a little bit of a different one. I know most of you are probably subscribed to hear my critique about the latest goblin representation in Magic the Gathering, but I came across something in my hometown the other day that I really want to talk about. It's somewhat of a tradition, it would seem, for me to release a video early in the year about something completely unrelated to the main topic of my channel, about something I desperately want to talk about. Last year it was the Cats movie, and this year it's some misleading posters in the windows of my local Wetherspoons pub, a topic that I am sure will be just as wildly popular and widely viewed as the former. Also, I want to put a content warning here before we begin. This video will be delving into misinformation surrounding the COVID pandemic, including, but not limited to, deaths due to COVID. I'll also be talking about the death of Belly Majinga, the systemic racism within the UK police force, specifically the Met, and I'll also be talking about the recent Spy Cops bill that was passed by the House of Commons in October. If that doesn't sound like something you're comfortable listening to, or if you have literally anything better to do than listen to an exasperated Welshman examine data and show you how it can be purposefully misrepresented to push an ideological narrative, then I do have other videos. Here's one. This one's a little bit funnier, a bit more energy in that one. Go knock yourself out. Now, for the 6 people who are remaining, what is a Wetherspoons? If you are one of my many North American or Latin American viewers, hola, by the way, you might not know what a Wetherspoons is. Wetherspoons is a chain of pubs in the UK, ran by a man called Tim Martin, pictured here, showing off his very impressive ventriloquist dummy. Now, Tim Martin, on top of founding and owning Wetherspoons, also fancies himself a political player. He donated £200,000 to the Leave campaign during the EU referendum. He's been a pretty big personal spokesperson for the Leave campaign up until the EU referendum and in the many years after, and he also really likes being photographed next to our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, pictured here doing what I believe he intends to be a welcoming smile. Now, on New Year's Eve 2020, which is coincidentally the day that I finished the first draft of this script because I'm just that cool and have so much going on in my life, a friend of mine said that they'd seen posters inside of our closed Wetherspoons proclaiming the truth about COVID or some such. I assumed it was going to be the doing of some loathsome middle manager, and I walked into town expecting a few black and white printouts of misleading charts and, I don't know, maybe some word art that says COVID-19, more like hoax 2020, or, you know, that kind of thing. When I arrived, however, I was quite surprised to see that the posters were not only very glossy, very well produced, in full colour, no less, but they also had official Wetherspoons branding on them. In fact, there had been a national rollout of these posters in Wetherspoons throughout the UK for a good couple of months now, as I found out when I returned home and looked up online. I'd only encountered it personally when my area went into a Tier 3 lockdown on New Year's Eve. And I want to talk about these posters. Originally, I wrote the script to discuss the whole 23 pages of the edition of Wetherspoon News that these posters were taken from, which is this pub newsletter of sorts. But it ended up being just far too long, and I wanted this to be something that I could maybe send to my nan so that she could have on in the background as she made her famous fruit cake. By the way, Nan, just in case you're not aware, I've been recently diagnosed with celiac disease, which means I can't eat things like wheat or barley or anything that has gluten in them. So unfortunately, my fruitcake eating days are behind me. But it does mean that I can safely say that your fruitcake was the best fruitcake that I ever had, and now it will be the best fruitcake that I ever will eat. So thanks very much for the good fruitcake memories. Now, back to the posters. Thankfully, we don't have to go off of just the grainy pictures that I took of my local Wetherspoons. You can download all of the 3 posters yourself in full high quality and zoom in and read all of the articles. If you too want to stick up COVID misinformation paid for by a millionaire in the windows of your own home. Broadly, these posters are just a promo for Wetherspoon News and... God, honestly, Wetherspoon News. It's really difficult to say. Wetherspoon News, it's like Demon's Souls. From now on, I'm going to call this Wetherspoons News. It's just easier. I have nothing but contempt for the people who made this. At least brand your propaganda in a way that makes it easier to say. Good lord. Now, looking at the first poster, there is a lot going on here, and you might think it would be pretty difficult to cram misinformation into what amounts to a front page graphic with some promotional links. But amazingly, Wetherspoons News has done just that. Firstly, and this is more of a marketing trick than anything else, but the very first thing that you will read on the front page of Wetherspoons News is the phrase, read by 2 million customers, which is a sly way of boosting up the actual readership numbers of Wetherspoons News. The 2 million customers number comes from Tim Martin, who has previously said that Wetherspoons in the UK serves 2 million customers per week, some of whom potentially also read Wetherspoons News. But read by some of our 2 million customers doesn't really have the same kick. It would be a little bit like me saying Spice8Rack is watched by 2 billion users because there are 2 billion monthly YouTube users, and presumably sometimes my videos make their way into their recommended tab. I bring this up partly as just, a little bit of a gag, a little bit of a jab at Tim Martin, but also to demonstrate Wetherspoons News' general attitude towards statistics and figures. The marketing team is very okay with misleading you about the readership numbers of Wetherspoons News, and that's a trend that continues with their COVID statistics as well. The next bit is the header of the front page. Good decisions depend on a wide range of views and backgrounds, but lack of diversity among political leaders leads to dangerous groupthink, followed by a bunch of members of parliament and their advisors who all happen to go to Oxford University. Now, Wetherspoons News is right, a phrase that really does pain me to say. They are right, in my opinion, to point out that, hey, maybe it's not a good thing that almost everybody who's running our country all came from the same university. Although this too is a little misleading. For example, there is a pretty big difference between the Oxford experience that Boris Johnson had, studying classics straight out of graduating from Eton, the most esteemed public school in the UK, which is famous, or infamous, for generating a surprising number of students who go out and just happen to become senior members of parliament, if not the Prime Minister, versus the experience of Keir Starmer, who first got his undergraduate from Leeds, being the first member of his family to graduate from university at all, and he later took a postgraduate course at Oxford. Now, I think Keir Starmer is a wet flannel who behaves more like Boris Johnson's annoyed personal lawyer than any real face of political opposition. But pretending that they are in the same intelligentsia club because they went to the same university to study different degrees at different levels from very different backgrounds is rather silly. Like, after Oxford, Johnson went on to write for the Daily Telegraph. Conversely, Starmer became the editor of Socialist Alternatives. Like, if they are part of the same groupthink hive mind, it certainly is a big tent. Now, we're almost past the first page of Wetherspoons News here, but there is quite a funny question posed right at the bottom. Are lockdowns the medical equivalent of the Maginot Line? Now, the Maginot Line, the pronunciation of which I'm surely butchering, was a fortification along the French-German border during World War II. It was set up to prevent a German invasion of France, which the Germans circumvented by invading Belgium first and then crossing into France through the unprotected France-Belgium border. What this metaphor seems to be suggesting is that lockdowns are a similarly flawed line of defence against COVID. However, what's perplexing about this metaphor is that Tim Martin wants lockdowns to be over. We can see this clearly in the other two posters, but I'm sure you can kind of get the gist from this first page itself. However, should we extend the Maginot Line metaphor further, then no lockdowns would have been the equivalent of no Maginot Line, causing the German invasion of France to be much faster than it would have been otherwise. Conversely, had a full Maginot Line been created across the Belgian border as well, the German invasion of France would have been greatly frustrated and delayed. This would have been the metaphorical equivalent of the more airtight and harder lockdowns that countries like Vietnam and China and New Zealand went through before they managed to successfully reopen their country in a safe capacity. But of course, Tim doesn't want that. Tim just wants you to think that lockdowns don't work whilst he makes a wild jab at French history. And I really do mean that Tim himself wants you to think. Now, it's not for certain that any aspect of these posters are Tim's direct doing. However, he does sign off on each and every page of the newsletter from which these posters are taken, with little editor's notes ahead of each piece. I'm not going to talk about the newsletter much at all, but I do find it quite telling how Wetherspoons News proclaims that it will present its readers with the facts and let them decide, before being sure to get Tim to praise articles he agrees with to high heaven and accuse articles he doesn't agree with of being literal psychological warfare written by people who have never gotten anything right before in their lives. Fair and balanced framing there. Now, back to the posters and the last line of the first one. We're 12 minutes into this video and we've not even got past the front cover of the newsletter. You can see why I edited this down. Now, saying that many doctors and scientists believe lockdowns are counterproductive isn't necessarily wrong, but it is pretty nebulous. Lots of doctors and scientists also think that lockdowns are productive. Science is rarely an exact, science. There can and are differences in opinions within the scientific world about pressing epidemiological issues. Scientists hold hypotheses, they run tests and studies and debate the conclusions. That's how science tends to work. And simply saying that an unspecified many doctors and scientists believe something is pretty reductive. Additionally, many doctors and scientists, I'm sure, agree that the manner in which the UK is implementing its lockdowns is counterproductive. Going into them late, leaving them early, doing a Christmas holiday in the middle of one as case numbers spike, etc., etc. But if you ask those same doctors and scientists if they believe that lockdowns in general are counterproductive, and you'll probably get very different answers. I could say that many doctors and scientists believe that oil companies aren't responsible for global warming. I bet there are many who do, but just saying that without providing quantifying context is an incredibly misleading statement. Like, many could mean 20, or many could mean 20,000. I imagine if there were 20,000 doctors and scientists who all agreed that lockdowns in general were counterproductive, then Wetherspoons News would have said that 20,000 doctors and scientists believe that lockdowns are counterproductive, rather than just saying, many. HMRC coming up to me in tax season at the end of this month saying, how much money did you earn last year? And I go, some. So that's the first page of Wetherspoons News critiqued, but in the interest of being, fair and balanced and unbiased and all that, is there anything about it that I think is good? Well, I like the cat that has the mask. That's a really nice touch. Love that little fellow, I do. On to the second poster, and oh boy, if you thought the first poster was a bit misleading, wait until you get a load of this. What they don't tell you about COVID. Hang on 1 second. What they don't tell you about COVID. Fewer beds taken up than last year, deaths a fraction of the grim forecast, 95% of fatalities and underlying causes, ... and how the facts can be twisted to strike fear in our hearts. How the facts can be twisted indeed. This is an article by Ross Clark, a freelance journalist who is writing here for the Daily Mail. And I want to go into the article itself, but there's part of this headline that really sticks out at me. We're given 3, supposedly, slam dunks against the severity of COVID. Fewer beds are being taken up, fewer people are dying than were expected to, and 95% of fatalities had underlying causes. And it's that last bit that's pretty sickening, frankly. It really seems to be saying, don't worry everybody, only vulnerable people die from COVID. Opening up the country only puts your elderly and immunocompromised friends and family at risk. No big deal at all. What a truly monstrous perspective. Mr. Clark qualifies at least some of these pre-existing conditions, saying that, for example, 27% of COVID fatalities had the pre-existing condition of diabetes. Which, oh, great, open the pubs, tear down the social distancing barricades. That's only 4.8 million people in the UK, only slightly under 6% of the population. Throw them to the wolves. I want to go clubbing again. The implication of this 95% number is that most of the people who have died from COVID were at death's door and that COVID simply tipped them over the edge. But if that were the case, there would be a range of causes of death attributed to people who were hospitalised with COVID. But that's not the case. 94% of the people who died during the initial wave of COVID had COVID assigned as the underlying cause of death. This isn't a disease which simply complicates and exacerbates the health conditions of people that are already suffering. COVID is the thing that kills the vast majority of people who die with it in their system. The implication that people who died from COVID were on their way out already erases the millions of people who suffer from pre-existing conditions who would have gone on to live lives for many, many more years had they not been exposed to this virus. Someone like Belly Majinga was a vulnerable person with a pre-existing condition, and she was working on the front line in Victoria Station at the start of the pandemic. On the 22nd of March 2020, she was working without the personal protective equipment that her employer should have provided her with, and she was spat at by a passerby who claimed to have COVID. She died on the 5th of April from the virus. She was 47 years old and left behind a husband and an 11-year-old daughter.
Comment voulez-vous qu'on se souvienne de votre femme?
Une très bonne personne, qui est attentif aux demandes des autres, aux souffrances des autres, prête à partager le peu qu'il a. C'est ça.
This is the kind of person that Ross Clark is gleefully informing us makes up the bulk of COVID-related deaths. If you take nothing else away from this video, let it be the understanding that just because someone has a pre-existing condition or is considered vulnerable during this pandemic, it does not mean that they don't have many years of potential life left. And even if they don't, that's still no justification from letting them die of a preventable virus. If someone is ill or old or otherwise a vulnerable person, it doesn't mean their life holds less value than someone who is considered less at risk of dying from COVID. They're people, you monster. Now, with the headline out of the way, let's have a look at some of these graphs, shall we? Eagle-eyed viewers will have probably noticed that this article is lousy with colourful graphs and graphics, and these are probably the thing that most people walking past a closed Wetherspoons will look at and remember before quickly hurrying on home. It is winter after all. Let's have a look at one of these. Death predictions and reality. Winter scenarios for COVID deaths in England versus actual. On first blush, this does seem pretty damning. Look at all these terrible predictions. Scientists warned us there'd be thousands of deaths by mid-December, and yet we are only seeing 400 odd new daily deaths. Look how all the scientists are wrong. We don't need a lockdown. But if you look at this graph a little harder, you'll begin to spot some issues. For one, we will see the word predictions in big letters and scenarios in small text underneath. Why is that? Well, it's because these other lines from Public Health UK, for example, are based on deaths in worst case scenarios in winter, not what Public Health UK thought was actually going to happen. The Spectator article from which these statistics are sourced makes it very clear in the opening paragraph that this is a scenario, not a prediction. This is what a winter would look like, with increased infections, people breaking lockdowns, tiers being improperly allocated, hospitals becoming understaffed, a right winter shitshow. These numbers and scenarios were created to prepare the people in charge of COVID prevention for the worst and to help them avoid it. Had the actual death count been closer to any of these lines, it would have been considered a national disaster. So there we go, the Daily Mail misrepresents data to push an ideological narrative. Not much of a surprise there. But let's look at another graph. There is the chance that Mr. Clark simply thought that scenarios and predictions were synonyms and not vastly different things. Critical care can cope. Critical care can cope! Now, this one is a double feature, 2 graphs in one. The first shows 2 COVID spikes overlaid over each other, supposedly, and the other, again supposedly, shows that the NHS isn't nearly as crammed as everyone is saying it is, with lots of beds to go around. Well, let's examine the first graph. It seems to be saying fewer people are going to hospital with COVID than they were in April, and the NHS coped then, so the NHS can cope now. Let's just sort of put aside the fact that the NHS didn't cope during the first peak of the COVID pandemic. The doctors and nurses and other workers for the NHS during that spike were under unbelievable amounts of stress, and on top of that, more than 620 of them had died as a result of COVID. So, take, the NHS did well back then, it can do with slightly less now, and shove it up your ass. But aside from this pretty basic fact, there are a couple of other problems with this graph. First off, it would be entirely expected for us to see fewer patients in critical care during this wave of COVID rather than the first. The NHS was not adequately prepared for the first wave of COVID thanks to government incompetence, and there was also a much sharper increase in general case numbers, as well as we didn't fully understand the virus yet, etc, etc. If anything, it would be more shocking if this winter spike had similar numbers of daily new critical COVID patients. That would mean we've not learnt anything from March until now. But you see, that's not the only issue with this graph. Here's the graph which Clark has taken his data from. See, our spring peak of critical care patients was really high, our autumn numbers were comparatively small, it's already going down, lockdown heads debunked, this was the peak. Provided, of course, that this was actually the peak. The trouble is, looking at only the first 100 days of a new wave of COVID as if it were the same kind of rapid peak we saw in March is a very flawed approach. But hang on, you might think, the graph is on its way down. Surely that means that this was the peak and that Clark was right to say that there are fewer critical care patients during this wave. And you're right, it was. Because we were in a lockdown. Just over a week after Clark published his article, however, the government lifted the so-called circuit breaker lockdown and encouraged people to go out and shop on the high street for Christmas. Now let's look at what happened afterwards. Here's the latest report from the Intensive Care National Audit and Research Centre. You can see that there was a slight dip after the first 100 days, which then bounced right back up again, showcasing in a pretty clear fashion that even a short holiday from restrictions during a wave of COVID has led to a surge in critical care cases. Had we stayed in the November lockdown throughout Christmas, then yes, that 100 new critical care cases would have been the peak. Had we had the short lockdown earlier in September, when scientists had suggested, rather than waiting until cases were already climbing, then this line would have been even lower. Here we can see the startling effects of what would happen should the bollocks to lockdown attitude prevail. Not only are we likely now to see cumulatively more COVID patients going into critical care throughout this wave in comparison to the first wave, but we're already seeing more COVID hospitalizations overall than there were in the first peak. Looking at the most recent statistics, there are currently 2,000 odd patients being admitted to hospital each day, around the same amount of people as were being hospitalised in the 1 week leading up to the top of our first COVID peak. Additionally, winter is always the busiest and hardest season for the NHS. More people get sick from a greater variety of illnesses. You're adding thousands of daily cases of COVID onto the NHS's already strained system. Even if it were just 100 extra cases a day, that would still add unnecessary risk and stress to our healthcare system. But if the NHS is so strained, then why are roughly the same number of beds being filled? Quite the conundrum. On to the second graph. The bottom line shows just how few beds in hospitals are being taken up with COVID patients and just how normal the amount of full beds are for the NHS for this time of year compared with last year. Now, presenting COVID as this tiny blip at the bottom of the graph here is A hilarious piece of misrepresentation. Here, Clark is comparing the numbers of patients with COVID-19 to literally all other hospitalized patients for all other illnesses and injuries. Like, okay, sure, I'm gonna hand it to you, Mr. Clark. COVID-19 is causing fewer hospitalizations as compared with literally every other cause of hospitalization combined. Wow, it really is nothing to worry about. But the more insidiously misleading part of this graph is where Clark compares the number of occupied hospital beds with this line, which is labelled average in 2019. And now maybe I'm a bit thick, but I'm not entirely sure what this pale line is supposed to represent. The way that Clark frames it, it seems like it's supposed to represent the average amount of occupied beds in the NHS in 2019, but if that's the case, why is it a mostly horizontal line with a slight indent during the summer? Surely it would be a curved line going up. I'm genuinely really confused. If somebody in the comments knows what this line is supposed to represent, I've had a look at the data, and I'm not entirely sure, but let's take it at face value. This line signifies the average occupied beds of the NHS, and here we are, mid-pandemic, and we're not even breaking the average yet. So there we go, the NHS can cope just fine. I mean, heck, it's not even as bad as the average of last year. Unfortunately for Mr. Clark's position here, pesky facts simply won't agree with him. From the NHS's official website, from which he sources the figures for his graph, hospital capacity has had to be organised in new ways as a result of the pandemic to treat COVID and non-COVID patients separately and safely in meeting the enhanced infection prevention control measures. This results in beds and staff being deployed differently from in previous years in both emergency and elective settings within the hospital. As a result, caution should be exercised in comparing overall occupancy rates between this year and previous years. In general, hospitals will experience capacity pressures at lower overall occupancy rates than would previously have been the case. So yes, the NHS has around the same amount of full beds this year as they did last year. However, because of measures the NHS is taking to prevent the spread of COVID throughout hospitals, hospitals have a lower capacity rate than last year. During winter, the NHS finds itself spread thin on even good years. The same amount of beds being full this year as there were last year will have a much greater impact on the NHS this time around. Also, what is Mr. Clark trying to say with this graph? Look, I know we're in lockdown, but the NHS is currently coasting just below our 2019 numbers, so we should open back up? What does he think will happen to this graph if restrictions were lifted tomorrow? Now, it's all well and good to dismantle how Clark is using data to make misleading graphs. It's a good exercise that you should do whenever you encounter an official-looking representation of data that doesn't quite sit right with you. However, the issue is no one looking at these posters as they pass them on the street is going to think, I should critically engage with these graphs, maybe go and see what the NHS has to say and check the Office of National Statistics to verify this claim. No, they're going to think that COVID isn't a big deal. But oftentimes just looking at how data is being misused and how graphs are being misrepresented misses the human capacity of this issue. And that's why I really want to play this short clip from BBC Question Time that aired last night, where Dr. Rachel Clark, who is a palliative care doctor and an author, is describing the current state of the NHS, just to fully demonstrate to you how devastatingly incorrect this claim that the NHS can cope is, and also how morally repugnant it is that Tim Martin has chosen to continue to display such a ludicrous and dangerous claim, which is at best an outdated estimation and at worst an outright lie in the windows of his several hundred closed pubs.
It's taking its toll on you.
Absolutely. So today we have had the absolutely devastating news this afternoon that we have reached a truly world-beating and bleak in the extreme milestone. So today, in the last 24 hours, over 1,000 people have lost their lives to COVID. Now, that's more than every single person who has died in Australia of COVID has done in their entire pandemic We've lost more than the Australian death toll in 24 hours. And in hospitals at the moment, conditions are unimaginable. We have ambulances queuing up outside. Patients, we can't get them out of the ambulances into hospitals because every single bed in intensive care, in the wards, in A&E is full. Tonight, I had messages from a doctor in London to tell me that police cars are delivering critically ill COVID patients into his hospital in London because there are no ambulances. That is how bad things are. How could the government have allowed things to get so bad? Sage told the government in September to have a circuit breaker. They told the government before Christmas, you have to lock down. And Boris Johnson ignored it because he's pathologically incapable of making a difficult decision, and that is reprehensible.
Now, that's the graphs out of the way. But even if you did take the time to read the writing around these graphs, you'll quickly realise just how little care Mr. Clarke, and by extension Tim Martin, has for facts and reality. At one point, Clarke writes, in mid-September, Sir Patrick being Sir Patrick Vallance, the chief medical advisor of the government, made the terrifying claim that the UK could see 50,000 new coronavirus cases a day by mid-October unless more draconian restrictions were introduced, yet we never got near that figure. Now, there is some truth in that statement, in so much that there was indeed a mid-September press conference where Vallance did say the number 50,000. However, if you actually watch this clip, where the number is taken from, you'll see Clarke's manipulative framing of the event.
At the moment, we think that the epidemic is doubling roughly every 7 days. It could be a little bit longer, maybe a little bit shorter, but let's say roughly every 7 days. If, and that's quite a big if, but if that continues unabated, and this grows doubling every 7 days, then what you see, of course, let's say there were 5,000 today, it would be 10,000 next week, 20,000 the week after, 40,000 the week after. And you can see that by mid-October, if that continued, you would end up with something like 50,000 cases in the middle of October per day. 50,000 cases per day would be expected to lead a month later, so the middle of November, say, to 200 plus deaths per day. So this graph, which is not a prediction, is simply showing you how quickly this can move if the doubling time stays at 7 days. And of course, the challenge, therefore, is to make sure that the doubling time does not stay at 7 days. There are already things in place which are expected to slow that. And to make sure that we do not enter into this exponential growth and end up with the problems that you would predict as a result of that.
There we go. This graph, which is not a prediction, can show you just how fast this can move if the doubling time stays at 7 days. And there are already things in place that are expected to slow that. Once again, Clarke turns a scenario into a prediction as if they are synonyms and not different things. And for those who think that the difference between a prediction and a scenario is a semantic one, here is the difference. Let's say I'm planning on going for a jog tomorrow morning, something that I will never do. If I wanted to predict what my jog would look like, I would use all of the available data I had about the busyness of the roads, the kind of weather we're expecting, what kind of breakfast I plan to eat before, etc, etc. I'd take the available data about what's most likely to happen and predict the outcome based on those factors. A scenario would be if I say, okay, but what if there's a change in weather and the road is more icy? What if I'm not in the mood for a bowl of cornflakes and instead eat a full English before my jog? I would then take those if factors and apply them to other known factors to create a scenario so that if the roads are icy tomorrow, I've already planned for a contingency. That's the reason why Vallance said the word if so much, even qualifying it with, and this is a big if. Modelling a live pandemic over the course of months is a lot more difficult than predicting the quality of a jog happening tomorrow morning, so scientists sometimes lean on scenarios rather than predictions, as you don't know what might actually happen. I'm sure there are scenarios that exist which factor in every person in England waking up tomorrow and following social distancing to the letter, wearing masks in public all the time, and not leaving their tier. It would be very foolish, however, to call the prospective case numbers and deaths that occur from that scenario a prediction, because I know people in England and there are some right bastards about. Now, back to Clarke's misrepresentation. Something to note here is that Clarke made sure to point out by mid-October we had not seen 50,000 new daily COVID cases. It was a lot closer to being 16,000, which was correct. Yet, that's not the only thing that Valence said. He said that if we saw 50,000 new COVID cases a day in mid-October, that could translate to 200 plus COVID deaths in mid-November, according to this scenario. This number was also off by quite a bit, but in a way that doesn't really support Clarke's stance that COVID isn't a big deal. You see, mid-October may have seen a comparatively lower 16,000 daily COVID cases than this scenario suggested, but by mid-November we were seeing 450 plus COVID deaths a day. Even without the 50,000 cases in October that this scenario imagined, we still saw over double the deaths that were in that scenario. And Clarke knows this. After all, he's been keenly following COVID death statistics, and this piece was published on the 20th of November, and, you know, he would have had to have watched the whole press conference to remember this 50,000 number. And even 2 weeks before he published his article on the 20th of November, daily COVID deaths were at around 390, which is still much higher than the scenario he is currently lampooning for being a wild over-exaggeration. Clarke is all megaphones and neon signs when worst-case scenarios of COVID outbreaks don't come to fruition, but the moment one model's death count becomes exceeded by reality, he simply forgets to mention it. It wouldn't be very easy to sell the idea that scientists are blowing COVID out of proportions when the virus ends up having a much greater mortality rate than some of their scenarios. Also, just as a little side note, the day before I sat down to record this video, the daily number of new people tested positive for COVID in the UK, this is the 3rd of January 2021, was at 54,990. Now, of course, Clarke couldn't have looked into the future to see that his claim that we never got near that 50,000 number would have been completely incorrect. Tim Martin, however, can very easily look into the present, where he is currently instructing his hundreds of pubs to put up this statistically misleading and out-of-date news article as if it were the God's honest truth about COVID. Now, Clarke's piece is lousy with these kinds of oversimplifications and fudgings of numbers, and whilst some can be attributed to just incompetence, I have to imagine that at least some are willful and purposeful mistakes on Clarke's part. This does, however, present quite a pickle for Tim Martin. Without these statistics and claims, Tim's anti-lockdown position becomes a darn sight shakier. To help with this, Tim's added credence to the bottom of this article with a second article at the bottom. Wow, that was a really poorly constructed sentence on my part, but I'm too lazy to change it, so I'm just going to keep it in. Here we get an excerpt from an article by David Churchill, where it's reported that the Department of Health and Social Care's official Twitter account called Clarke's above article misleading and then deleted their tweet. Churchill triumphantly proclaiming that after the tweet was removed, the department failed to identify a single error in the figures and data. Now, I don't mean to imply that I'm better at spotting misinformation than the people working at the Department of Health and Social Care, but it's been pretty easy for me, someone with literally no background in biological science whatsoever, I didn't even take it as an A-level, to pick apart the statistics in this piece, even just by looking at the sources of the data itself. So, and this is speculation of course, but what I think probably actually happened is Someone managing the Department of Health and Social Care's Twitter account saw Mr. Clarke's article, recognised it immediately for the hogwash that it is, then correctly tweeted that it was misleading. That person then received a very angry phone call from their supervisor a few hours later, where they explained in probably very colourful language the strict policies regarding social media messaging from government departments. Our exasperated social media manager then deleted the tweet and were told to not go near the subject again as long as they lived. However, social media operator for government body deletes correct tweet doesn't really have the same ring to it as Department of Health in climb down. Department of Health in climb down after online swipe at the Mail's analysis of COVID-19 facts and figures. Keep all of this in mind when considering the call to action of Wetherspoons News. Wetherspoons calls on the public to reconsider the evidence regarding lockdown. The evidence they're talking about is that found in this article, a bunch of fudged numbers and unreliably recounted events concocted together by one freelancer at the Daily Mail whose previous work includes such zingers as how tragic that coronaphobia is turning our land of liberty into a Stasi-like state, where he compares £100 fines for breaking COVID regulations to George Orwell's 1984, because of course he fucking does. I could spend another hour or two on this article alone, there is a lot of it, but I think you get the general gist. Attempt at a counter-narrative against the severity of COVID, counter-narrative falls apart when you examine the data, rinse and repeat. Okay, on to poster 2, and I did say I didn't want this video to be too long, so I won't dwell here for too long. Wow, God, I have a degree in creative writing, and I can't even write a sentence that sounds fucking... I can't even say words! Amazing. I probably shouldn't be recording this when I haven't eaten yet. I won't dwell here for a large amount of time. The rightmost piece is pretty easy to take apart, as it's largely just Lord Sumption or Sumption. I'm going to say Sumption, I think. A retired Supreme Court judge saying that COVID restrictions are part of an authoritarian power grab by the government. They've given the police loads of power, introduced new laws and fines quicker than they should have been able to, and all of this is being fueled by COVID propaganda. Now, I agree with Lord Sumption. Look at that. Me agreeing with a lord. 2021 is truly a cursed year on some of his claims. The police being given loads of power to hand out fines is bad. Fines are just a way of making certain laws legal for people who can afford to break them. However, what I do find a little bit disingenuous is how Lord Sumption is loudly decrying the police being given too much power to police COVID restrictions, but has been surprisingly quiet when the police have been given too much power in other avenues. For example, Lord Sumption never spoke out against the recent Spy Cops bill, which handed unprecedented power to undercover police officers, legitimising the use of unnecessary and perverse force, including rape and murder, if such action was deemed necessary in such wildly ambiguous scenarios as the interests of the economic well-being of the UK. His lack of outcry when arguably more insidious and dangerous powers had been granted to police officers in the past points more to the idea that Lord Sumption doesn't like the police having more power in the specific context of COVID restrictions. Why might I be making that assumption? Well, Lord Sumption isn't observing the government lockdown and doesn't want to get done in over it. Shocking. You can give undercover police officers power over life and death, and Lord Sumption will sleep. Give them the ability to fine him should he host an inadvisable party with some of his mates during a pandemic, and Sumption will awaken and activate like a high-tech security droid made of cobwebs and contempt for the poor. The final piece is probably the most level-headed of all 3 articles that are contained within the Wetherspoons Posters. Here we have an article from The Guardian, which broadly critiques the UK government's half-measures approach to lockdown restrictions. Although this piece by Larry Elliott does not contain wildly incorrect statistics like Clarke's article does, it is not without its flaws. It compares countries that didn't have harsh restrictions, like Sweden, to the UK in a very favourable capacity, saying how Sweden's loss of GDP is less than that of the UK, and how fewer people have died in Sweden than a particular study suggested would. Sweden gets brought up a lot by lockdown skeptics the world over. After all, comparing the number of deaths per capita in the UK and Sweden certainly makes it seem like lockdowns don't work. I mean, we in the UK are on lockdown number 3, and yet we still have more deaths per million people than Sweden, and they never locked down. Now, international comparisons are finicky at the best of times, and originally I'd structured this bit around comparing lots of differences between these countries that may explain why vastly different approaches to COVID had similar effects, at least per capita, between the UK and Sweden. I'd explain how Sweden has a much lower population density in comparison to the UK, how more people live alone in Sweden than the UK, lots of material factors that probably gave Sweden advantages when it came to dealing with COVID. I'd also talk about how peer-reviewed studies such as this one concluded that the high volume of testing and low number of deaths suggested that South Korea experienced a small pandemic relative to other countries, and that caution is needed in attempting to replicate the South Korean response in populations with larger, more geographically widespread epidemics like the one we're experiencing in the UK. But then I realised a few things. Firstly, this article isn't trying to say we should have done things like Sweden or South Korea. In fact, the sole conclusion, as it were, of this article is that an effective test and trace system is the key to a successful pandemic response. Now, I don't think that it's as simple as this one thing will solve our pandemic issue, although it certainly would be nice to have a test and trace system that isn't a ludicrously expensive failure. It would be rather ironic if it were discovered that Tim Martin had financially supported the party which began and continued the privatisation of our healthcare, which has led to the failure of the track and trace system that his posters is now claiming is the key to safely leaving lockdown. Oh. Well, that's a bit awkward. But, seeing as this article has been presented in anti-lockdown propaganda, let's engage with this international comparison as an argument against lockdown. Both Sweden and South Korea had fewer deaths per capita and less of a GDP contraction than the UK without instituting hard lockdowns. Whether or not Larry Elliott meant to imply by these comparisons that it was lockdowns that caused the contraction of GDP, or that lockdowns generally aren't effective at saving lives, it doesn't matter. Tim Martin has positioned this in such a way that it is now supposedly supporting his own anti-lockdown ideology, so sorry Elliott, you've been had on this one. Write better articles so they can't be so easily reframed. Little journalism tip there. But let's examine the first claim. Sweden and South Korea both had smaller GDP contractions than the UK. Do lockdowns lead to large GDP contractions? Well, it depends. Let's have a look at Sweden and South Korea. We can see here that there is certainly a contraction in their GDP, and they do bounce back. Not a full recovery from the contraction, but certainly a growth. This is compared to the UK, which managed to slow their GDP shrinkage, but has yet to start growing again. There you go, you might say. The major differences between the COVID response of these countries were lockdowns. Lockdowns hurt the economy. But of course, that's a very simplistic perspective. Let's have a look at the GDP trends of some countries that did very well documented, strict, and as some news outlets have labelled them, overreaction lockdowns. China, New Zealand, and Vietnam. Now, obviously, each of these countries had very different kinds of lockdowns and restrictions, but broadly, their restrictions were certainly a lot more all-encompassing than Sweden and South Korea. Here we can see a similar trend, with a GDP contraction followed by a bounce back. However, the bounce back that these three countries have experienced has already made up for their GDP contraction and then some. All three of these countries will leave 2020 having grown their economy. Vietnam even managed to avoid any contraction of its economy, constantly growing, albeit less than it would have, during the pandemic year, which is genuinely something to behold. Obviously, there are lots of differences between these countries, and no doubt if Sweden had entered their pandemic response the exact same way Vietnam had, it would have led to different results. But it is rather telling how certain people prefer pointing at Sweden and saying their model works, only 9,000 deaths and a 4.7 contraction in GDP, as if that is the gold standard for a COVID response. Like, if we're going to make simplistic international comparisons, I could very easily point at Vietnam and say, well, their model works better, only 35 deaths and an 11.24 increase in GDP. The reason, however, that someone like Tim Martin prefers you to focus focus on Sweden over somewhere like Vietnam is that if we adopted Sweden's model right now, all of his pubs get to reopen. That's the purpose of this. Not speaking truth to power, not shining a light on better science. Tim wants his pubs open. Tim wants to make lots of money. On that note, there's also another reason why people like Tim really don't want you thinking about the way Vietnam is doing things. Because, well, I'll give you 3 guesses. Also, only 35 COVID deaths. You heard that right. 35 COVID deaths in a country with 95 million people. That's champion. That's unbelievable. Well done, Vietnam. Now, you could do all of this again with deaths, comparing Sweden with its Scandinavian neighbours, all who had comparatively tighter restrictions, most of whom experienced a broadly similar impact on their GDP. But that kind of misses the point. The unspoken part of all of these posters is where everybody, including Tim Martin himself, knows that not having a lockdown will lead to more deaths. Even if COVID was as blown out of proportion as Mr. Clark would like to have you believe, if we left lockdown tomorrow, deaths would still go up. What these posters are trying to get you to think is that those COVID deaths, which would not happen otherwise, are a worthy sacrifice to save the economy. And our lives are a sacrifice that Tim is willing to make. But all of this begs the question, why is the UK failing so badly at both preventing COVID fatalities and escaping the recession that so many other countries that did lock down managed to avoid? Well, therein lies the difference between the UK and all of the countries I've just talked about. Whilst it's true that all countries adapted as time went on during the pandemic, no one began 2020 with the perfect pandemic plan, and whilst it's true that Sweden and South Korea have been rethinking their approach, no country has danced in the wind as much as the UK, at least in Europe. First, the government downplayed the virus. At the start of 2020, Boris Johnson was holding steady on the herd immunity line, even going so far as to boast about how he shook hands with COVID patients before contracting the virus himself. After a month of pissing time away, the government finally began our first lockdown, far too late to prevent the UK's first wave of COVID deaths. Then, when we came out of lockdown, the government encouraged people to flock to restaurants with the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, and so the cycle began again. Step 1. COVID is not a big deal right now, go out and have fun. Step 2. Okay, COVID is still a big deal, but we won't do anything to curb it. Step 3, abrupt and disruptive lockdown that's simultaneously far too late to be as effective as it could have been, and far too fast to give people time to materially and emotionally prepare. It happened with the initial wave, it happened again when the government ignored scientific advice to have a 2-week circuit breaker lockdown in September, instead waiting until November to lock down, before lowering restrictions 1 month later as cases were rising so that everyone could go Christmas shopping, and it happened again at the start of this year, with SAGE, the scientific body that advises the government, recommending that schools should be shut to prevent rising COVID cases as early as December 22nd. The Tories then waited until the evening of Monday the 4th of January, remember that date, to go into a national lockdown, after schools had already reopened that day. Just to put how abruptly and disorganised these sudden lockdowns are, here's a BBC report of Boris Johnson saying there is no doubt in my mind that schools are safe. Published on the 4th of January, literally just a few hours before he announced schools would be shut as part of a national lockdown. There is a laundry list of reasons why the UK's response to COVID has been such a deadly shambles. The unwillingness of the Tories to commit to early lockdowns is one. The failure of privatisation manifesting in our disastrous track and trace system is another. Government ministers and advisors breaking their own rules, making the public wonder ever more why we're listening to these pricks. The focus on criminalising breaches of COVID regulations as opposed to ensuring that people have the support they need to properly follow the guidelines is another major issue. The group Liberty has outlined a series of far more effective provisions to support people during the pandemic rather than slap them them with fines and leave the question of if they're going to be evicted at the end of all of this up in the air. Putting the police in charge of getting people to follow COVID rules also entangles the systemic racism of the police with the response to a pandemic that is already disproportionately harming black and brown people. For example, black and brown people are up to 4.5 times more likely to die from COVID here in the UK than white people. And during the initial wave of COVID, the London Met stopped and searched nearly a quarter of all black 15 to 24-year-olds in the capital, wildly disproportionate to their treatment of white people in the same group. When people say that the COVID response is racist, they aren't making things up to get mad about. They're highlighting the disproportionate impact that COVID has on people of colour, on their communities, as opposed to white people. Studies like this one into the human impact of Sweden's pandemic response clearly show that it's not just people who are medically vulnerable to this disease who suffer the most. COVID exerts an unequal burden on the most disadvantaged of society. The people who work for people like Tim Martin are far more likely to suffer as a result of lifting restrictions than Tim Martin will himself. But Tim Martin doesn't care about his workers. After all, they had to fight to make him pay their missed wages at the start of the pandemic. Tim was guaranteed to receive a government grant to pay his employees furlough, like every other business in the UK. And Tim refused to pay the furlough until the government check had cleared, leaving his 4,000 plus employees on only half a month's wages at the start of a pandemic. Tim Martin, the multi-millionaire pub magnate, wouldn't even temporarily reach into his own pocket before the end of the month to pay his employees 80% of half a month's wage when he knew for a fact he would be reimbursed by the government a few weeks later at most, even going so far as to tell his employees to get jobs at Tesco instead of waiting for him to pay them. And you want me to believe that this guy gives a shit about the government's COVID response and how it's affecting working people? Fuck off! Big up to the organised workers of Wetherspoons, by the way, for forcing Tim to do a U-turn and actually pay you. Sorry that your boss is such a prick. There is so much wrong with the way that the clowns in Parliament have mishandled this pandemic from day one. But restrictions and lockdowns are not the problem. It's the way they are being implemented, and it's the government's failure to properly support, educate and lead by example that's leading people to lap up the kind of misinformation that Tim Martin has in his windows. It's their failure to prepare the NHS, to make schools safe, to create a functioning test and trace system, to save the people they're supposed to answer to. At time of recording, nearly 80,000 people have lost their lives here in the UK due to COVID, and we will pass that number before the end of the week. It didn't have to be like this. Provided that from now on the government acts on scientific advice when they receive it, rather than delaying quote-unquote difficult decisions until people are already dying, then we may not see 100,000 deaths. This is the reality. COVID is dangerous and has killed far more people than it should ever have, both here in the UK and throughout the world. But Tim Martin doesn't give a shit about that. The only time death is mentioned in his turgid fucking propaganda paper is when it's to prove a projection wrong or to try and convince you that the deaths of vulnerable people don't count the same as the deaths of healthy people. All to try to get you to pressure the government to reopen his pubs. He's a heartless and disgusting creep. Wear a mask, engage with media critically, unionise your workplace. Fuck you, Tim Martin. And there we go. We've reached the end. But stick around. I appreciate the people who do. I'll just give you a little nugget of something at the end. It'll be nice and fun. But yes, I just want to say thank you. It's sort of like it's been 2 years, give or take, since my first ever YouTube video. And in about 2 months' time, it will be the 2-year anniversary of my first video, sort of like taking off and kickstarting this YouTube career of mine. So it's been very strange. It's been a blast. I'm looking forward to when it is safe to come out of lockdown and I can, go to events and say hi to you all and, sign some things and generally be less charismatic and more bumbling in person than you could ever imagine me to be if you just watch my videos. But yeah, I just want to thank you all for watching. And I also want to thank my patrons, because YouTube doesn't pay me any money. well, it does pay me some money, but YouTube does not pay enough money for me to survive on ads alone. So the people who make up my patrons also make up the vast lion's share of my income. Without them, I would not be able to make YouTube videos at all. So I just want to thank some of my patrons, the $10 patrons, of which I will now read out their names in a loving fashion. So a big thank you to 1, 2, 3, 4, I declare a class war. 7th guest, a fool of 5 colours, a gay American couple, a malevolent benevolence, a socialist hobgoblin, Adam Gable, Addy DC, AJ Ingram, Alex Berman, Alex Flynn, Alex Wood, Alice Paralis, an alt-right sleeper agent who gives money to communists Baka Idika and then in parentheses probably Tibox Versona, an Umbreon pastry, Anna Lisa Milano, Anthony Baker, Anthony G. Reap, Avery is a good magic player. See Joe the thespian said it. Now it's true. Stop making fun of me. Bambi Roper. Basu Gasu Baku Hatsu Baku Matsu. Ben Pike. Biscuit Blade. Blake Evers. Bradley Rose. Brian Dunn. Cairns. Carl Comstock. Chase Beard. Chad X. Krista Voss. Cerso Saresa. Cloud Chaser Kestrel. Cognitive Glitch. Conflicted Psyches. Corwin Stoddard. Darius Rudaminer. Deadpan Goth. Dolowen, Drew Pierce, Dystopico, Exidian, Eldritch Changeling, El Fonzie, Erica Hamel, Ethan Abraham, Felix Mortem, Fiona Perry, Future Beagle, Gerolf's Zombie Boyfriend, Grey Days, Guillermo Murcia, Hoopered Up. I am saying this only because our global economic system does not intrinsically support artistic expression. In response, I bolt myself. Jake Colburn, Jessica Settle, Joe Benson, Joey DeBroeder, John Solog, Johnny Rifle, Joshua M. Steffen, Julie Bunn, Julius Home, Just Mild Lilac, Carlia Whithart, Karl Marx is my spirit animal, Kate B, Kevin Quinn, Kurdape Apologizer, Leliana, Lily of the North Star, Literally a Ghost That Pushes Over Candles, Linnea, Madame Monroe, Magic Arcanum, Mike Mavramatis, Mr. Skolaton, N. Ben, Omar Al-Habaihi, Oops All Signy, I hope I'm getting that right, Ori, Puck, Raghava Cavalli, Riddle of Lightning, Ross King, Rowan Brown, Sage Morrison, Samuel Kona, Sasha Evelyn Francis, Sean Caius O'Reilly, Several Goblins in a Trench Coat, Sheepwave, Silent Celine, Sir Shaunsey, Skurs, Sky Johnson, Sodaman64, Swan Hunter, Taylor Street, The Reaper of You, Totally a Spy, Trans Rights Baby, yeah, love that one, Trey Ernst, Trey Parker, True Lily, Vittorio Grace, Vladimir Gorvakov, Voice of All, Wicked Haiku, Xenon, Zada's Ludonarrative Dissonance, and Xanoron. And a big additional thank you to everyone who is my patron, $1, $2, $5, $50, doesn't really matter. Thank you really quite a lot for any amount. I really appreciate it. Thank you to everyone who's watching. Thank you to my family as well for hopefully sitting through this one. Maybe you learned something, maybe you didn't. I thought I'd make something that maybe you could watch without having to pretend to understand what I'm talking about. Wetherspoons is a little more accessible as a topic than Goblin cards. But yes, thank you all for watching. And I'm going to have another video out, hopefully, at the end of this month as well, which I'm going to be working with one of my good mates and another cool YouTuber who I really, really like. And anyway, I'm going to leave now, so thanks all for watching, and as always, stay spicy.